All right, I'm doing something a little bit different today. What I'm doing today is posting one of my short stories from my first book, The First Prince, and other short stories. This is a short story collection that introduces a fictional world that I made up. I published the book last year, and I just thought it would be fun to release the audio of one of the short stories for Halloween. So this story is called Assassin. It is a story about a gnomish assassin who has planned the perfect murder. Now, this is intended to be a creepy short story for children. Sometimes I refer to it as a children's horror story, but it probably doesn't really qualify as horror. It might depend on how you define that. It isn't gruesome. It's not gory, but it is about a gnomish assassin who wants to commit a murder. So if you check it out, you might want to listen to it before you let the kids listen to it, just in case, because it is intended to be creepy. The full audio version of the whole collection should be available next month. Last thing I'll say is I don't have any video to go with this audio because this is the audio from the book. So I'll just loop in some of my brother's artwork and probably just some stock images that seem kind of thematic for the subject. Mostly, I just hope you enjoy the story. Have a safe Halloween. Go read a book. Read my book. Assassin, a creepy story for children who want to know what lies in the dark. Setting, one of the many untamed forests of Kel. Vermis turned the dagger over in his diminutive hand, the light of the moon dancing coldly along the whisper-sharp edge. Vermis was a gnome. He wore a gnome's oversized pointy hat, colored black, and a gnome's three-button vest, also black, and securely buttoned. He wore gnomish pants, made of spider webs carefully woven without the sticky strands, and dyed very carefully in matching black. Matching was very important to gnomes. Everything had to be just so. Finishing his attire were his patented gnomish boots, good for stomping on cats or bounding off of turtlebacks. The dagger was special, magical. It had been painstakingly forged deep under the crust of Kel, far from any taint of the moon's twin sister, the sun. It was long, like all gnomish daggers, from tip to pommel. It was as long as Vermis was from the tips of his cat-stopping boots to the very end of his regulation gnomish hat. The blade was grandly curved, arcing from the hilt all the way to the very tip, as sharp as a beam of starlight when winter reigned king of seasons. Now, most people will tell you that gnomes were either very rare or not even real. The truth is they are so sneaky and crafty and evil that most people never saw them until it was too late. Actually, most people never saw them at all. They just got in arguments over who stole the last cookie from the pantry, or over who let the chickens out so a fox could gobble them up in the dark of night, or, on other occasions, about who had tripped someone at the top of a flight of stairs, or shoved them over a hill to tumble far, far down below, or cut off someone's head when no one was looking. It is true that over the centuries a handful of kings and queens had seen the gnomes, and a few princes and princesses as well, but only very briefly, and just before they died. Gnomes liked the people they killed to know who had done the deed, whether it was the famous Tigman Tuck, who was famous for poisoning his victims over weeks and weeks, and would reveal himself to his victim only during their very final moments, or the tricky Jean Manouk, who liked to ride on his victim's shoulder or hide under their hat, breaking their neck at just the right moment, and then letting them fall far down the stairs. And then there was Vermis. Vermis was an angry little acrobat with a penchant for sharp, shiny knives. He was a terror to squirrels, and he had come that close to skinning a cat. Only the cat had disarmed him and chased him back into his hole, and then escaped at a leisurely pace before he figured out how to slay it without the knife he had dropped while tactically retreating at high speed, as fast as his short legs could hurl him across the green grass. The only problem was he had not managed, as yet, to kill any actual people. But That was all about to change. He admired, again, the dagger in his hand. All the components of the dagger had been carefully selected. Not one piece of it had ever seen the light of day. The iron and minerals had been mined from deep beneath the crust of Kel, near the lava flows of the realm of the Fire Lords. Dust gathered from the flutterings of cavern pixies had been liberally dusted over the blade as it had cooled in the intervals between hammering the blade into shape and heating it in the gnomish forge. And finally, oil stolen from the lamp of a cavern cyclops, one of the mysterious cast-off guardians of the surface, was used to quench the blade. The handle had been made from the dried stem of a mushroom, which Vermis had stolen himself from the garden of one of the naiads that lived in the underground rivers that crisscrossed under the surface. Even the sheath had been carefully crafted from the hides of insects that only lived under the crust, deep in the bowels of Kel, far, far from the wretched sun. It was a challenging process, turning the exoskeleton of a cavern insect into leather, but the gnomes had learned the secret long centuries ago. On a certain level, Vermis understood that the moon was not evil, and that many of her numerous children would have been called righteous by nearly anyone. Pixies, for example, were known to light crossroads for lost travelers, leading them away from such terrors as the children of Agram. And unicorns had a horrible reputation for saving maidens from many creatures that haunted the nights of Kel. The simple truth was it was easier for creatures like Vermis to ply their trades in the coldness of night, and in the sparse light the moon spread over the surface of Kel. He himself had never actually seen the sun, as he made it a religious practice to be safely back under the crust before she forced her luminance upon the surface each day. Legend claimed that when a gnome was caught out in daylight, they were turned into a strange and brightly colored material, which was hard and smooth to the touch. Rumor claimed that some tasteless humans would actually collect these sun-cursed gnomes and use them to decorate their gardens. On the other hand, rumor claimed that some discerning dryads kept collections of these plasticized gnomes to mark the boundaries around their trees, warning other gnomish scouts to keep their distance. Once more, Vermis admired the glinting, hungry edge of the dagger. Tomorrow night would be a full moon, and his opportunity for the perfect murder would make him famous amongst all the gnomish kingdoms. He had no idea why the old lady only sat on the bench on the nights when the moon was full. Most people knew that was the most dangerous night of the lunar cycle to be out of doors. But that was a detail that mattered little to him. What mattered was the bench she sat on was the perfect height, and the distance from his hole, his gate to the surface, was the perfect distance. And now he had the perfect weapon. He had practiced his technique for months, and now it too, he was certain, was perfect. Ever since the night he had been out raiding squirrel nests, it was much easier to raid the nests at night. He had seen the old woman alone on that odd little bench, knitting in the cold moonlight. Vermis had been obsessed with killing her, not just killing her, but it had to be perfect. With great reverence, the little gnome set up his practice target, right where the old woman would be sitting tomorrow night. He smiled, his pointy little teeth gleaming in the light of the moon, almost as brightly as his dagger. The target was a thick, hollow reed, which he had gone to great lengths to acquire, as reeds only grew on the surface, and the closest river was a full night's journey from Vermis's cave. It was just thick enough to be like a human spine. He carefully placed a watermelon on top of it. It would make a mess, but hopefully the mess would attract some squirrels. Vermis was getting hungry, and he was tired of eating grubs. He needed to keep his strength up, because his perfect murder required all the skill, cunning, and perfection of mind and body that could only be attained by a gnomish assassin. Searching the ground, he found a pigeon feather. Vermis picked it up and held it, frowning as he judged the wind. A strong headwind would slow his approach. A strong tailwind could make him arrive before he was ready with a killing strike. And a crosswind, that might blow him completely off the mark. Everything had to be perfect. He released the feather and smiled. It fell gently to the ground, unaware of its role in the homicide he was planning. Almost ceremonially, Vermis walked back to his tiny cave, and going inside, he closed the entrance. He sat cross-legged on the ground and hummed quietly to himself, trying to get the spirits of murder to bless him. Occasionally, he would neurotically examine the edge of his knife again, but he needn't have bothered. It was perfect. Finally, his tiny angry eyes popped open, and with a silent war cry, he leapt from his cross-legged position. Then he limped for a few steps, because his legs had fallen asleep. Shaking some life back into his limbs, Vermis took several deep breaths, breathing in through his very long nose and out through his tiny mouth. His tiny eyes glowed in the darkness of his cave as he told himself to focus his killing energy. Finally, in a wild rush, Vermis burst from his cave and leapt into the moonlight. He spun into the air, the curve of his knife flashing in the available light. His left palm touched the ground as he somersaulted towards his target. 1 flip, 2 flips, 3 flips. Landing on both his feet, Vermis had just a moment to judge his distance to his target, the reed acting as a spine, and pushed off hard with both feet, leaping literal inches into the sky. He turned and twisted, keeping the edge of the knife always in the direction he was moving so it would not create undue friction with the air. And then, his perfect moment, as upside down and completely at one with his murderous instinct, Vermis soared under the edge of his watermelon, his perfect blade whispering through the reed. Vermis landed in a crouch on the ground, weapon in a dramatic guard far out to his side, the watermelon tumbling past him, breaking on the ground and splattering everywhere. A wicked grin flashed across his pointy little face. Everything was perfect. Vermis did not get hardly any sleep that day. He tried, but he was so excited. Each time his eyes closed, all he could see was the look of surprise on the old woman's face as her head toppled from her shoulders. He woke up smiling every time, but he was so aware that he needed his sleep. Of course, he could only imagine the old woman's face. He had never seen it beneath the bonnet she always wore. But all humans looked the same to Vermis. She was old and frail, and her neck was skinny. The soon-to-be famous gnomish assassin sighed. It was grubworms for breakfast again, but not after tonight. Gnomish assassins that killed humans did not eat grubworms. No, it would be rat for him. Fricasseed, stir-fried, roasted. Whatever he wanted. Vermis pondered over whether one could hard-boil a rat. He had never seen anyone try. He might just have to make the royal cooks do just that once he returned from his perfect kill. Dreamily, he imagined the uproar it would cause as he dragged the head into the great hall of gnomes. It had been a long time, before Vermis's own hatching, since a gnomish assassin had brought in a human head for a feast. His principal rivals, Gomelhash and Wazamuk, would see green for weeks. The king would probably give a speech before all the assembled gnomes of the kingdom. Why, Vermis might even get an audience with the queen. He had never met the queen before, even though she was his mother. The origins of gnomes is a hotly debated subject amongst the human and some faun scholars. Due to obvious challenges about humans and fauns being far too large to explore gnomish caves or caverns, most researchers have to make do with the theories they can extract from solid corpses of gnomes that have been caught out in the light of day. The famous Olinian theorist, Francis Dubois, suggests that each gnomous kingdom has a queen, which lays eggs, and a king, who reigned as long as he could maintain power. The faun philosopher Hemistocles argues that gnomes are a form of bipedal insect and probably live in underground hives. It is said that the Eastern researcher Emir, son of Omir, was granted an interview with the legendary gnomish assassin Tigman Tak, but no one has seen him since then, and his laboratory and all his notes were destroyed in a mysterious fire. Most researchers agree, based off of the available evidence, that the reason gnomes are such mean little buggers is because, with the exception of the queens, who are jealously guarded, they are all male and no one ever hugs them. Vermis sighed as he rolled over in his sleep. Everything would be perfect. Vermis blinked. What time was it? He pulled his watch out of his vest. Gnomes were very proud of their watches and clocks. They were very important to help hunting gnomes and gnome explorers to keep out of daylight and such. Oh, it was almost time. Talking nervously to himself, Vermis took account of the gear he would need for his expedition. Dagger, forged far, far from the light of the sun. Check. A roach bladder, filled with the venom of a purple recluse. Check. His special assassin gloves, to ensure his palms did not sweat and make him shift his grip during a critical moment. Check. And finally, his special hat. Vermis removed his everyday evil gnomish hat and placed it on its peg on his cave wall, and then, with great care, he took his special assassin's hat from its peg and placed it on its head, making absolutely certain it covered his bald spot. It was pointy and black and looked exactly like his other hat, but now, he felt like a stone-cold killer. Gleefully snatching his dagger up, Vermis ran for all he was worth to the entrance of his cave. Nervously, he peered out the opening. There she was, just now shuffling across the grass. She had her pink bonnet on tight, and her pink shawl covering her shoulders, and her pink knitting bag embroidered with bunnies and flowers all ready for her last night alive. Vermis's teeth chattered. He was so excited. Perfect, 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 he babbled. He waited, his patience competing with his anticipation. As the old woman shuffled to her place on the bench, he could hear her muttering to herself as she rummaged through her knitting bag. With care, Vermis lifted a pigeon feather off of the ground and repeated the test he had performed every night during his training sessions. The moonlight glinted off his pointy teeth as the feather gently drifted, swaying back and forth a little as it fell to the grass. There was almost no breeze at all. Forcing himself to walk, Vermis returned to the mouth of his cave and made his preparations. Reverentially, he knelt down. He had decided crossing his legs was not a good idea, and focused his will on the spirits of murder. Focus, he mumbled quietly in the privacy of his cave. Focus. His extra long nose began to tingle, and he knew he was ready. It was now or never. Glory or absolute failure. A human head in the Great Hall of Gnomes, or grubs for the rest of his life. His tiny eyes popped open, glowing evilly in the darkness of his cave. Meticulously, he took the bladder full of purple recluse venom and poured it over the edge. The purple recluse was a carefully guarded secret of the gnomes. Its venom was potent and would absorb through the skin or the eyes or mix into soup and go down into a victim's stomach before they knew what happened. Vermis had worked for weeks to get the venom to coat his blade, but it would be worth it, he knew. Blades cut better when they were wet, and he needed the cut to be perfect. His tiny teeth glinting evilly in the darkness of his cave, Vermis knew everything was ready now. He crept with care towards the entrance, peering out once more. He was nervous. If he had taken too long to prepare, she could be gone, and then it would be a whole month before he would have another chance for his perfect murder, and he had used all his purple recluse venom just now. Ah, there she was, huddled over her knitting. Strange that a human would come into a gnome-infested forest in the darkness of night to knit, but no matter. Perhaps it was the only time she could get away from her family. She probably had a whole deluge of grandchildren, Vermis reasoned. He was certain that was why humans knitted, for grandchildren. It had occurred to him as well that the bench was awfully small for a human. He would have needed to plant a gnomish trampoline in the grass if she had been as tall as most humans, but fortunately, her bench was, well, it was the perfect height for him. This had puzzled him slightly, but he had just decided to accept it as a blessing from the spirits of murder and to not overthink it. Taking a few deep, focusing breaths, Vermis visualized the outcome he wanted. It was exactly one cartwheel, one somersault, and 3 flips, then a bound, and his special turning, flipping, upside-down cut. Then it would be dead human and fame and all the rat he could eat. He took a final, focusing breath, in through his really long nose and out through the tiny, teeth-lined mouth. Finally, with a silent war cry, Vermis burst from the cave and leapt into the moonlight. He spun into the air, the curve of his knife flashing in the available light. His left hand touched the ground as he somersaulted towards his victim. 1 flip, 2 flips, 3 flips. Landing on both his feet, Vermis had just a moment to judge his distance to his target. The old woman was still knitting away, unaware of the doom that crouched just behind her, and pushed off hard with both of his feet, leaping literal inches through the air. He turned and twisted, keeping the poison-coated edge of his dagger always in the direction he was moving so it would not create friction with the air. And then, just as he was turning upside down, the edge of his blade whispering through the moonlit night, the old woman dropped her embroidered hanky. "Oh my," she muttered, reaching down to pick it up off the ground. Vermis stared at the empty space as he soared over her shoulder, his venom-coated blade whispering harmlessly over her exposed neck. This was not perfect. Vermis was so shocked, he soared through the air upside down, hitting the soft ground and tumbling, cursing until he came to a stop. The old woman blinked when she heard the sound of the wailing gnome a few feet in front of her. "Hello?" she asked in an ancient, kindly voice. "Is someone there?" "Wah!" was the only answer that came from the darkness. "Oh dear," the old woman replied, clutching her knitting to her skinny chest, her long nails glinting in the light of the moon. Vermis emerged from a pile of leaves, shaking his dagger angrily at the old woman. "You ducked!" he accused her. "You ducked! You ducked! You ruined my perfect murder! You person! Ah!" The old woman pushed her spectacles back up her stumpy nose and peered at the angry gnome. "My," she said, "aren't you an angry little thing?" "Bah!" answered Vermis. "You ruined my perfect kill. It was perfect, perfect. Why did you have to duck?" The old woman blinked, her huge yellow eyes gleaming in the light of the moon. "Duck, dearie? Whatever do you mean?" You ducked," the gnomish assassin accused. "Just as I was about to cut off your old head, you ducked. Now my dagger's all dirty, and my hat is missing, and I didn't kill you." The old woman sat up a little straighter, a frown crossing her wide mouth. Well, that is a problem, isn't it, dearie? Ruin your fun, did I?
Yes!
Then Vermis blinked. He stared at the woman, who was still knitting. He had never seen her face before. She had always faced away from his cave. And he had never been curious enough to get a better look at her, as he wanted to kill her, after all, not paint her portrait. It was then he realized that she was not knitting with needles like he had seen other humans do, but she was knitting with her nails. They were long and sharp and black, and they glinted in the moonlight in a way that made Vermis suddenly uneasy. He pointed his dagger at her, and then he frowned. She just kept knitting, as if he had not just tumbled out of the sky with a venom-coated dagger aimed at her neck. He peered at her, trying to get a better idea of what exactly was under that bonnet. He could see now that she had large, angular eyes, which were presently nearly slits, focusing on her knitting. She was counting under her breath, and once in a while, Vermis noticed the glint of sharp teeth or the flick of a long, sharp tongue against her thin lips. And then there was the color of her skin. Vermis had never noticed it before, but now it was obvious her skin was unlike any human he had ever heard of. And he knew that humans came in a strange array of different colored hides, but he did not think any of them were green.
Who? What?
He muttered as he tried to sort out this strange puzzle.
What are you?
He finally demanded, his voice squeaking in the silence of the night. The old woman did not answer him at first, her nails clicking against each other. Oh, are you still there, dearie? I'm sorry. I was counting. What did you need? Vermis took a step closer, shaking his knife at her again.
You're not even human, are you? Oh, this is terrible.
Her yellow eyes widened in surprise, and she placed a large, long-fingered hand against her skinny chest. I? Human? Oh, dear me. What ideas you young people have. As she was talking, she took an embroidered cloth out of her bag and tied it around her neck, fastidiously draping it over the front of her blouse. It was then Vermis noticed that she was not wearing any shoes or pants, and he could see she was covered in fine, light-colored fur from the neck down. Click, click, click. Vermis puzzled over this. How had he never noticed that she was covered in fur? Humans were not covered in fur. That meant... He took another step towards her, getting a better look. There was something terribly wrong here. Click, click, click. Done, she said suddenly. Holding up her finished work, Vermis could not see the huge grin that split her face from ear to ear, but he could see her ears, because they had popped out from under her bonnet and were pointing out to the sides now.
Ah!
Vermis sucked in a startled breath.
You're the Goblin Queen. You haunt the woods.
She peeked at Vermis over her finished work. I? A queen, dearie? As she spoke, she placed her knitting bag aside and then carefully placed the tablecloth she had just finished over her lap. Well, she went on whimsically, I suppose some do claim as such, though I think a queen is supposed to have a colt and probably some courtiers, and lands and such. I just have my bench and my knitting. Oh, and a few hundred children I have borne over the centuries, that's true too. She smiled then, her huge needle-sharp teeth seeming to gather in all the light provided by the moon. Now, dearie, tell me your name. Vermis stood up to his full height of 6 inches.
I am Vermin.
Chop! Oh, she said around a squishy, chewing sound. Oh, that's tasty. There was a little more noise of chewing, crunching, and slurping. Hmm, she said thoughtfully. This one was fattened up nicely on grubworms. Gives it a sweet taste. Much better than those rat-fed ones. Those are too stringy. She noticed something glinting in the light and peered down into the grass. Curious, with two long claws, she picked up Vermis's special dagger. It gleamed in the moonlight. Oh, she beamed. A new hat pin. Wiping the venom off on her bib, she straightened the blade between her long fingers and stuck it in her bonnet. For a while, the Goblin Queen sat quietly on her bench, as she had every full moon for hundreds of years. She wondered idly how long it would be before another gnome found the cave she had built behind her bench and provided her with another treat. They always seemed so proud and surprised when they found the hole, and never asked themselves who had lived there before or what had happened to them. After a while, she wiped her claws off on her lapcloth and wiped her face off with her bib. Then, sighing, she rose from her bench and hobbled out of the clearing. The end.